All right, guys, continuing on with period five. You need to be aware of some other events leading up to the Civil War. I don't have time to go through them here, but you've got them in the review book, and also we will handle some of these in class. But you need to be able to trace the ways in which Uncle Tom's Cabin, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, and the election of 1860 lead us up to the point where Civil War breaks out. Now, before we get into the actual Civil War as we know it and as we've talked about and you've looked at, you need to be aware of why people supported one side or another. And it is a pretty much north-south divide. But as far as people who were for seceding from the Union, in other words, breaking away and forming their own confederacy or their own country, which is Southern people for the most part, these people were for, and these people were for the war because honestly it all boils down to slavery, but it ties in with slavery and states' rights. It's the state's ability to judge whether or not they want slavery. Also, there's financial reasons. The South feels like they've been left behind and that the North receives all the financial advantages of the United States, that they're better off and they're more taken care of, I guess you could say, by the United States. And then, of course, there is a slavery aspect of it as well, from an economic and a social and a political aspect and all that. People who were against, well, all right, now before we get into the Civil War proper, you need to be aware of some of the advantages and disadvantages that both sides had. As far as the North goes, their advantages were number one, they already had an established infrastructure. Railroads had expanded pretty well in the North by this time, and it was because of their manufacturing, the manufacturing aspect of this part of the country, and the fact that they needed to get products in and out, either raw materials in to convert to finished products, and then an ability to get finished products back to other parts of the country. So they already had a railroad system set up. Also tying in, like I said just now, with the factories and the industry, if need be, if war breaks out, they would be able to more readily produce war goods than the South would because they had factories that had already been producing clothing and weapons and all this stuff. I mean, hunting rifles and stuff like that. But they could convert those into wartime industries, and then they had a larger population. As far as their disadvantages go, they really, at the beginning of the war, did not have very many qualified or experienced military commanders. For whatever reason, most of these people previously in wars had come from the South, so they're going to start the war a little bit behind as far as leadership. As far as the South goes, as far as their advantages go, first of all, they didn't really have to win the war. They just had to make the North quit, is really all they had to do. So they could fight on a very defensive basis. They didn't have to go in and attack places in the North because they're not trying to take them over. They're just trying to hold what they see as their independent confederacy. They also had cotton, which is a very valuable agricultural commodity. So from their point of view, they had a ready-made money source. If they needed to raise money, they could sell cotton. And also it ties into the fact that they thought European nations would support their side because of their reliance on Southern cotton. And then last, it goes back to the disadvantage of the North a while ago, but they had very able, very qualified, and experienced military commanders. As far as the disadvantages go, it really comes down to a lack of. It's a lack of population, and it's a lack of industry. And that's because in the South, the majority of the place was set up on the plantation system. So there's very few cities in the South. There's very few what we'll call urban centers. So when you've got a majority of your land devoted to farming, you're going to have a smaller population. And also, there's very little industry because they were so reliant on cotton and slave labor and producing a raw material that they had no need to provide the factories to furnish the finished goods. They would ship them up north or over to Europe. So for that reason, when it came to producing war goods and clothing and things like that, they were just not as nearly as well equipped as the North. All right, next on our list of things, especially at the beginning of the Civil War, are what are we going to do with the border states? These are the ones that kind of toe the line. They're the buffer zone between the North and the South. And Kentucky and Maryland are the two major ones, but Missouri and Delaware play, I believe Delaware, yeah, Delaware play a role in this too, in the fact that they're very important to both sides. Like, number one, for their location, and the fact that, as I said, they are a buffer zone between the North and the South, and also their resources. There are some agricultural parts to these states. There's also a little bit of industry with regards to them as well. So one of the things that President Lincoln has to do during the war is to try to kind of keep these guys from going to the South. So he can't really go out and alienate them. For instance, Missouri is a slave state. Slave state. He can't go out and make these people mad, or they're going to shift their allegiance to the South. So he kind of has to toe a line with regards to how he treats them. All right, so as with every war, we got to talk about the turning points, and the turning point of a civil war is Antietam. And when the Union, when the North wins this battle, it does a couple of things. Number one, it keeps England and France, it keeps Europe out of this war because the South had kind of banked on the fact, as I said earlier, that if when war started, when hostilities broke out, that Europe would come in on their side because of their reliance on the raw material of cotton. Well, as the war goes on, excuse me, and the Union wins at Antietam, they decide to stay out of it. So the help that the South was expecting as a part of their process of winning the war never occurred. So it really put them at a disadvantage as the war goes on. The victory gives Lincoln the moral authority because things turn with this battle. It looks like the Union victory is going to be inevitable. So Lincoln gets the moral authority to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, in which he frees the slaves in all territories south, which actually doesn't free anybody, but that's not really the point here. The point is that the Emancipation Proclamation gives a moral cause to the war. It gets Northern abolitionists fired up for the war effort, and it renews the vigor and the enthusiasm with which people from the North fight the war. All right, so now we move over to some of the political actions that occur on the part of Congress during the war. And the first and probably the most important is the creation of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroad companies. Not the creation of them, but what they do is they decide they're going to build a transcontinental railroad, and it's partly for military purposes to get people and war goods, soldiers and war goods from one place to another in the event of war. And also, we'll talk about it later on, is to tie in Asian trade and stuff like that. But it happens as a consequence or in the midst of the Civil War. The next is going to be the Homestead Act of 1862, which is going to deal with lands that have been picked up previously in the West and what to do with these lands and how to settle them. What it does is it offers cheap and then sometimes free land to people who would move to the West. And then the last political action by Congress, and this is really by Lincoln, is the suspension of habeas corpus during the war, which really ties into an expansion of presidential power in the fact that, let's see, I don't know how I want to word this, but before, with habeas corpus, what that means is that you have to be brought before a judge and you have to be charged with a crime before you could be prosecuted. Well, during the war, I guess because of how long it takes or this process of it, Lincoln suspends it and says you no longer have to be brought before a judge and formal charges being brought against you before you can be prosecuted for a crime. So we're moving away from the war here and moving into Reconstruction. Be aware of Gettysburg. It was one of the major battles. Be aware of the courthouse at Appomattox and the peace treaty that was signed and all that. So we'll move forward to the amendments of Reconstruction and what it deals with how the country is going to deal with newly freed slaves. So you've got the 13th and 14th 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that you need to have nailed down in your head. And what it comes down to is the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in the United States. The 14th gives citizenship to these slaves who had been freed. And then the 15th Amendment deals with voting rights for these slaves. I would also be aware of the reactions that happened because of these with regards to the restrictions that the South attempted to put on African Americans or freed slaves after the war. All right, so very briefly, because we're just kind of glossing over a lot of things because of time purposes, but that doesn't mean that this is all you should know. We move towards Reconstruction. Now, there's two kinds of Reconstruction, or two types you need to be aware of. Number one is presidential Reconstruction, which you'll have in your review book, which deals with the policies enacted by, or attempted to be enacted by, Lincoln and President Johnson, who comes into office once Lincoln is assassinated. And then you have congressional or radical Reconstruction, which is what you have here. The causes for this are due to the efforts of a group of what were called radical Republicans in Congress. They come in and basically they're looking for a more punitive form of punishment for the South. In other words, as far as what it takes to be accepted back into the Union, what it takes to be a member of the government, once again, if you're from the South and all this kind of stuff. And really that's the main difference between the two types is how you're going to treat the South. And really that's what Reconstruction is. In response to some of the things that have been enacted through radical Reconstruction, you need to be aware that black codes come up in response to this. And those are restrictions on the rights and in some cases the liberties of slaves in the South. In response to this, you see some race riots break out in places like New Orleans and Memphis. And then it all comes about from the fact that people in the South are trying to undermine the 14th Amendment, which is the one that gave African Americans citizenship in the country. As far as some of the programs of it, under Radical Reconstruction, the South is broken up into 5 military districts under the control of soldiers, of United States soldiers, and all that. So I know that's a very brief description and it's not that great, but we'll handle it in class as far as how to compare these two different types. So, as far as what happens to African Americans after the Civil War, once they're freed as slaves, really for a lot of them, to be honest with you, not a lot changes. Okay, they don't have much opportunity. They can't find a way to get anywhere else. So, what they do is they slide into a system called sharecropping, which means they basically rent land from people, from whites. And what happens is they have to borrow money to put these crops in and then to harvest them, and then they have to pay that money back, plus pay either monetary value or crop value back to the person who owns the land. They have to pay rent on it. So what happens is they end up in a cycle of perpetual debt, which means they basically end up, basically in the same plight that they were before, other than the fact that they do have some freedoms. They just don't have the ability to enjoy those freedoms. And then black codes, as I said a while ago, comes in as well. Which is passed by Southern legislatures as a way to limit the rights, freedoms, and such of freed African Americans. And finally, briefly, the last thing we've got to deal with in this period is the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. Now, guys, this all boils down to the fact that we had a disputed election in 1876 between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. What it boils down to is there was a series of disputed votes, which a majority of those were in southern states. So we end up with conflict out of this. Who's going to be president? And tensions begin to get so high that people are fearful that the South is going to leave the Union again. So what they do, like we've always done, like I've said a million times, we come up with compromise. And what happens is Rutherford B. Hayes is going to assume the presidency out of this, and then out of it, Reconstruction is effectively going to end. So this ends the period of Reconstruction. So in period 6, we're going to transition from, okay, Reconstruction has happened, the nation's back together as much as it can be at this point. Now what's going to happen? And in period 6, we're going to talk a lot about industrialization, immigration, the rise of cities, urbanization, and a lot of stuff. So this wraps up period 5. We'll go to period 6 and keep on rolling. But remember, as always, this is a very brief overview of content. It's not exhaustive. It's not everything you need to know. But these are the basics you start with, and we fill in the blanks in class from there. So I appreciate you holding with me so far. We'll continue on to period 6 in the next one.